Right, then we have Dayet Boyd Zulani Munyai, who's asking about the prepared speech. Right, so I've got lots to say about the prepared speech, but I wonder if I shouldn't be talking about giving prepared speeches behind a mask to students who are all at least 1.5 meters away from you and from each other, and a teacher somewhere else. Okay, let's just talk about the prepared speech in the old normal. What it's going to be like in the new normal, that's a different matter. But let's go to the old normal. So you said, how do I plan it? And how do I present it? So these are the 7 steps of public speaking. I got this out of an American book, and I really, really like it. So I do it with my public speakers, and I do it with my classes, because it works. It seems to me to be nicely scaffolded. All right, there are the 7 steps. Let's just look at them. Topic, sharp focus, material, design, outline, practice, and present. All right, the right topic. Now, let me pause and go to this. It's from Unarine Nemangwela. You've said formal speech. So this is the same concept that we're looking at. You're going to speak on violence in schools at a young leaders conference next week at a community hall. Write the speech. So here you have been given the topic. So you have a topic of violence. But you might be told, choose your own topic. The topic is usually quite broad. It's quite wide, like violence, or if we're talking about V's, the virus. Once you've got a topic that you feel, okay, I have something to say about this. So you need to look, this formal speech on violence, you need to look at the fact that you have been given your audience. You've been told that they are young leaders. So these are already intelligent, well-informed young people. I think it is a good idea to assume that your audience is always intelligent and well-informed, no matter what topic you choose. But step 1, get your topic. And it's step 2 that I find that my students don't spend nearly enough time thinking about. What does it mean to bring the topic into sharp focus? Well, let's take the topic of violence, since we've been asked to look at it, and remember, we know who the audience is already. The sharp focus is, what am I going to talk about? So you might say, what do I know in my own community? What do I read about in online newspapers and magazines? South Africa, are there any particular concerns? What about my province or my city? What violence am I particularly interested in? Am I interested in gender-based violence? Am I interested in violence in schools? Am I interested maybe in gender-based violence in schools as being a particularly South African issue. So the bringing it into sharp focus is what exactly in this very, very broad topic of violence am I going to be talking about? What is going to be the place where I zero in on? What am I going to be talking about? Okay, so let's say we're going to talk about gender-based violence in schools, and we're going to link it to bullying because we know that that is an issue. So we've brought it into sharp focus. So where were we? Those were our 7 steps. Okay, so we've got our sharp focus. What do we now do? We have to find material. Now this is terribly important because this is where you do research. So where should you start? You should start in 2020. You start now. So we had, I suppose, 2 normal months if you're going to look at school-based violence. That's what you're going to have to focus on. January and February of this year in South African schools, what was reported? So a lot of students simply go on the net and they call up the first search engine and they read whatever comes up first. You can't do that. First of all, we have already sharpened our focus. We're looking at schools, and maybe we need to say even sharper. Are we going to do pre-primary, primary, or high schools? Are we going to look at urban or rural schools? Are we going to look at special schools? Are we going to look at technical schools? Do you see how we started off broad, we came down, we thought it was narrow enough, and no, not nearly narrow enough. So let's say we wanted to focus on urban schools. So we're going to go urban schools in what they call the leafy suburbs, so the more privileged areas, and we're going to look at urban schools in, are there schools in squatter camps? Or in townships? Maybe I want to look at township schools. Okay. So do you see, I've eliminated the pre-primary. Now, am I going to look at primary and high? Okay, I'm going to get rid of special and technical. I'll have to explain, it's too broad. So I'm looking at January and February of this year. What was reported in South African urban and rural schools? No, we've taken out rural. Urban schools, I want to know, were there any incidents reported of gender-based violence which could be related to bullying? Do you see how we've narrowed it right down? And now we're looking for the most up-to-date information. So this is the finding material. What am I looking for? I'm looking for stories that I could tell. I'm looking for stats. But you've got to be so careful of stats. You've got to look at who did it, how did they do it, what was their method, how many people did they speak to. Stats are dangerous. I'm looking for police reports. Maybe I'm looking for SMT or SGB reports. So coming out of the Department of Basic Education, those reports. Where else would I find material? Possibly I want to look at, is there some kind of education outlet? So maybe I want to ask the unions. So I ask SADTU or NAPTOSA or NUE or whoever, if they've got anything. Should I look at psychologists working with school children? Should I look at social workers who might have been called in? Do you see your research, and obviously most people would start online, but you can do research in any way, get hold of material. But you are now looking for specific things. All of this, these 7 things we've listed, are to do with January and February of this year in South Africa. This is what we're looking for. Now, you might find a whole lot of other material. Then you need to decide, am I going to use 2018? Am I going to use 2016? Am I going to use something coming out of Singapore? Is it relevant? I might find a quote from an American psychologist that is very interesting in relation to South Africa. So yes, I am going to take this report that I happen to stumble across. This step, how long does it take? I don't know. 2 weeks? 2 months? That's the finding the material. And as you find the material, you might find that this becomes even more sharp focus. In other words, you are sharpening the focus all the time because you find something particularly interesting in Limpopo, particularly interesting in Eastern Cape, and you start following that. So this is the time-consuming step. After this one, and you've spent time on. Now, what do I think generally happens? I think my students skip step 2 altogether. They will give me their outline. In the old normal, we would get into groups, and in the groups, students would say to each other, well, look, this is the topic I thought of doing, but no, actually, I haven't even got it into sharp focus, and I haven't even done any research. And they would share that kind of, well, I haven't even started. If you started, I haven't started. And then I would ask them to say, well, suggest things to the person. So the person doing violence, oh, no, don't do bullying. We've done bullying to death in LO. Why don't you do some other idea that they've got? So that's part of step 2, bringing it into sharp focus. Then you go out and look for material. What if you find nothing? So we come back to this. What if there's nothing in January and February because by then the coronavirus was dominating everything? So you say, okay, I'll go back to May to December of 2019. I'll widen my scope and see what I can find. But this takes time, and finding the material takes time. You've got to be prepared to put in that time. What do a lot of my students do in the old normal? The night before, they'd look it up, they'd print it, or get their parent to print it in the afternoon at work, and they get up and they read me something off one website. And I'm going, I'm bored. Because there was no thought. There was no, I found this. Now, these things link in this way. And look, I found this. And then they were so interesting. And then I thought, if that person could have heard that, I wonder what that person would have said. That's not happening. Why? Because these steps weren't done. Right, moving on. Where do we go now? Now we design the speech. So this is, how long have I got? So let us say you have 5 minutes in grade 11 or grade 12. You obviously need everything we all know, the intro, the body, and the conclusion. And you now design your speech. Remember, you put in your citations. These are your references to all that material that you found when you were doing your research. Now, a lot of my students say you can find this on // Please don't do that. Say, there was such an interesting article published in The Atlantic by Professor so-and-so of Harvard. And his main point was, I'm going to read you a little section of it. However, I found that this was criticized by somebody from Stuttgart. And this Dr. Herr so-and-so, commenting on Professor Buddy Buddy, said this. Now, why I found this so interesting was, do you see when you're designing your speech, you're designing research plus your own comment and interaction. your engagement with, I can't fit that in, your engagement with the material. This is part of the design. Now, how much research and how much comment? You need to be guided by your teacher, because each teacher has her own preference. I'm looking for 70% research and 30% comment. Comment, I want to put there not sort of anecdote. I don't really want to hear, oh, I was putting this car together and then I brought a part to school and they beat me up for it. That's story, it's anecdote. Yes, if there is an interesting anecdote, you can tell it. You can say that at our school we have a problem with gang violence, and there was this incident that, if you're talking to your class, you all remember happened 2 weeks ago. That's fine, but how are you using this? How does it relate to the research? How does it relate to anything? And what is your comment? Because what are you bringing me? Your comment is bringing me insight, something I hadn't thought of before. So that I come out and we're having a cup of tea or something afterwards. You see, old normal. Now, will you have a cup of tea? Not if you don't touch your mask. So old normal, you come out, you have a cup of tea, it's a competition, everybody's a tea and a sami or something, and you're saying, that was such an interesting speech. First of all, I didn't know about this research, and the insight this child had, the new idea that this child came up with is fantastic. Right, so that is designing your speech. Please notice you look at lengths. Obviously, you're looking at audience, and you're looking at the basic structure. How am I going to begin? What's going to be in the middle? How am I going to conclude? Your outline of your speech is your cue cards. Now, I think what we have to have in the middle here is the speech in full. Maybe I should make it the 8 steps of public speaking. Once you've designed it, I really want you to write it out in full. At that point, I want you to time it. I cannot tell you how often I have got my little timer on and I put it on to 5 minutes so that when it goes beep, 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 the child has to stop. And I'm listening and I'm writing my notes, and the child stops and I press stop and the child has spoken for 1 minute. It's meant to be a 5-minute speech. Do I give the child a mark? What you said was actually quite interesting. Let's say 6 out of 10 divided by 5, because you've given me 1/5 of the speech. Or do I just penalize and say, sorry, there was no development, there was no insight, there was so little research, I could hardly even see it. You had not designed it. You did not bring your speech into sharp focus and give you 1 out of 10. I'm going to get to the 1 out of 10 anyway. You got up and you spoke. Well done for that. But beyond that, right, so you've got your speech in full and you've timed it. And it's only a minute. Then you do some more research. You think about your focus. You expand slightly. Maybe it was too narrow. You were talking about the violence in schools on the 8th of January. Well, maybe you should bring it out a little bit, whatever it was, until you get it to the right length. And remember, you're delivering it each time. You're not just reading it silently. You're delivering it the way you would deliver it to an audience. Now you've got it in full. Now you do the cue cards. Now, technically, your cue cards should be 1 card with a mind map on it, with the main points on your mind map, and that's it. All right. Most students are too terrified to do that. We used to have an HOD of Afrikaans at our school. 12 words. That was it. So obviously this was a first additional language, so it was slightly shorter, but she said 12 words. And she would check that as you got up, all you had were 12 words. Because otherwise you're not speaking. You are reading. And if you've learnt it off by heart, well, Just hide the fact that you've learnt it off by heart and make it sound as natural as you can. But you can't read it. You cannot deliver a speech saying, my first question is about verbal and visual clues. And this is very interesting because, no, you're not talking. It's public speaking. It's a prepared speech. You're engaging with your audience. So you need cue cards. So my students usually want a lot of cue cards. So let's imagine for a 5-minute speech, you're going to need at least 5 cue cards. Number them. I tell a very famous story, so I've told it over and over again. It was my first or second year of teaching, big competition, very long speeches. Our student was going up the stairs. You know, in halls, quite a few of those halls have stairs at the side. She dropped her 30 cue cards, hadn't numbered them. The adjudicator was very pleasant, said, you know, take your time, take a deep breath, put them in order. But she couldn't put them in order because they weren't numbered. And I learned from that. That was my fault. I should have said to her, have you numbered your cue cards? Somebody needs to remind you. So please number them. And then you should have only keywords on each card. Now, my students' ideas about keywords is to print their speech or write it out. Then they cut it up into strips and they stick it on each card, and then they say that those are cue cards. No, they're not. Once you've got genuine cue cards, then you need to practice it. So we've outlined the speech, we've written the cue cards. Now we go to the practice. So how do you deliver? Well, that's what I meant about old normal. Old normal. You stand comfortably, balance yourself, legs not too far apart, you don't want to look like that, not too close together, comfortably on your hips. And you've got your cue cards. Let me just fold this. You've got your cue cards in your hand, and you hold them comfortably about there. Don't pretend they're not there. A lot of my students fold them into things this big, and then they have to bend their head all the time into it. You hold it comfortably, and you're going to make sure you make eye contact with everybody. You make sure that your voice is thrown comfortably to the back of the classroom. You're easily audible. Nobody's straining to hear you. You use pause, because pause is very effective. You allow yourself a pause to check your next point so that you can look up and speak again. You vary the pace so that sometimes you go a little quicker and sometimes you go a little slower. You modulate your voice so that you're not screaming or yelling. You modulate your voice. So your voice has a lovely timbre, has a lovely sound. You try not to be too high-pitched because people don't like to listen to that all. So you lower your voice slightly. Try not to sound sexy, right? You know, etc. You practice your speech. Now, what about the new normal? Well, first of all, you're behind a mask. And all they can see are your eyes. And you're trying to get your voice to the back of the classroom. I think the new normal is going to be a little tricky. First of all, you've got to be 1.5 meters away from each other. So if you've got 30 people in your class, are half your class in the playground while you're delivering to half the class who are 1.5 meters away? I don't know. Certainly, I think speaking behind that mask is going to be interesting. And it's going to be interesting for all of us. Some of the teachers are saying, well, we've got to get used to listening to students behind the mask. A lot of my students have railway tracks on their teeth and those elastic bands. So now I've got railway tracks and an elastic band and a mask. Right. Do I know where the new normal is going to be? Not a clue. But I suggest relax. First of all, we will be told what is going to be required. Will you be doing a prepared speech? There's a prepared speech sitting in home language and FAL's SBA tasks. Will it happen? Don't know. I should imagine that there might be other options. So you might be told that you can record it and maybe send it via WhatsApp or something like that. Don't know. Do you have that kind of technology? Do you have enough of that? I don't know. But these are the basics. If we just come back to this and let's look at our last one, is present it. The question is, how are you going to present it in the new normal? But as I say, I wouldn't panic. What are the things that stay the same? Get a topic. This, which none of my students do anyway. That, which my students pretend to do but don't really do. This, well, they're not designing the speech because all they're doing is printing something off the net. They don't do cue cards because they just cut out the speech that they printed. Do they practice? No. I say to them, did you time the speech? No. So I think this is the least of our worries really at the moment. Let's see if we could get these 6 steps like really, really good, really brilliantly done. And we'll worry about the presenting later. Okay, so let me go back to my questions. Where was I with all of this? All right, so this one from Unarine, the speech on violence. You need to tell me why you felt you couldn't even start it. What was the problem? It's a young leaders conference. You're talking to young leaders about violence, and it's in your community hall. So it's really about violence in your community. Remember, don't tell them stuff they already know. Don't say, as you all know, and then tell them what they already know. That's going to bore them to death. Okay, so that takes care of that.